Once again, I have more facts about the 1920s, and they're more random than ever. Perhaps your friends think the onslaught of 1920s trivia is over. After all, it's been quite a few months. Then, when they least suspect it, corner them, trap them in a room, and tell them some of these. We all know John F. Kennedy, but did you know that his father was in the film business? In 1926, Joseph F. Kennedy and a group of investors bought the Film Booking Offices of America, which was a movie studio that made mostly low-budget movies. He was also a significant investor in a string of theaters. He may not have been nearly as big as Louis B. Mayer or Adolf Zucker, but he was well known enough in the industry to be featured in film magazines, along with pictures of his children. Considering the future of the Kennedy family, this is a cool thing I found. You have John, also known as Jack, and Bobby, but Ted wasn't born yet. Another lesser-known 1920s figure was Andy Razaf, who is best known for writing lyrics for popular songs, including the 1929 hits Black and Blue and one of my personal favorites, Ain't Misbehavin'. Well, get this. His aunt had been the Queen of Madagascar until 1897, so he had royal blood in him, though by the 1920s, the royal family in Madagascar had been overthrown for more than 2 decades. But it's still kinda cool. A big event happened on radio in 1924, when the popular singer and radio star Wendell Hall got married live on the air on the Ever Ready Hour program. This wasn't the only radio marriage in the 1920s, but it was certainly one of the most famous. This year, there has been a lot of attention to the fact that someone can run for president from prison. But I don't want to get into modern politics on this channel. I do want to say, though, that this actually isn't unprecedented. In the 1920 election, the Labor leader Eugene Debs entered the presidential race on the socialist ticket as he sat in a prison cell. He had been imprisoned the year before, after having been convicted of sedition in 1918 for publicly opposing the military draft during World War I. He didn't have a chance of actually winning the election, but he did receive more than 3% of the popular vote. In silent films, a group of musicians were often used when filming emotional scenes in order to make the right atmosphere so that the actors could cry or more accurately express the right emotion. This was only possible because they were silent films, which is why the practice completely disappeared after talkies took over. And speaking of music and silent films, organs were actually considered the ideal instrument for musical accompaniment. While there was piano accompaniment, organs got much more attention at the time, which is a bit flip-flopped, I think, from what many people today think. If you look into movie palaces, you'll find that the big ones had very fancy and very expensive organs, demonstrating that they were thought to provide a grander background for the movie. The Roxy Theater even had 3. And usually the musical accompaniment was neither completely scripted nor completely improvised. Instead, the musician would often have a cue sheet so that they would know when to prepare for a mood change or play for comedic effect. Often, cue sheets for specific movies would have recommended musical motifs for the musicians to play at certain points. And for big, ambitious productions, they would sometimes come with a fully composed score. Between 1924 and 1927, the Negro League in baseball had a World Series of their own called the Colored World Series. And an extra interesting fact was that the series in 1924 and 1927 had 1 tied game each, and the 1926 series had 2 tied games. And just in case you want to know, here were the winners of each Colored World Series. 1924, the Kansas City Monarchs. 1925, the Hilldale Club. And for 1926 and 1927, the Chicago American Giants. And since we're on the topic of baseball, the MLB game with the most innings played happened on May 1st, 1920, between the Boston Braves and the Brooklyn Robins at Braves Field in Boston. In total, 26 innings were played, which for all you baseball fans out there seems like it would take maybe 6 or 7 hours, but it actually only took 3 hours and 50 minutes, which is about half as short as the longest MLB game by time. And just to add another novelty for a modern baseball fan, the game ended in a 1-1 tie because there were no lights at the stadium and the sun was setting. This continued to be a thing that happened for decades afterwards. So, in other words, the longest game by innings didn't even finish. In late 1928, talkies were beginning to take over Hollywood. Some still thought it was a fad that would go away, but most by that point saw that they were the future of the industry. But talkie was not set in stone as the name for the new innovation. People called them talkies, but it was never really made official. And some people hated the name. So the trade magazine Exhibitors Herald World started a campaign to find a new official name. Over the course of a few months, people in the industry, from low-level exhibitors to big studio bosses, sent in their ideas for new names. Some simply wanted it to stay as talkies, but there were over 250 other names sent in. I won't go over all of them here, though here's a picture of a lot of them. Among the suggestions were movie talk, recordion, picture tones, living pictures, flickasound, filmotalk, phonophotos, and camera phone. Some of the names make sense, but could you imagine calling movies Verhabla or Alivu? In 1927, the British statistician L.H.C. Tippett wrote a book consisting mostly of random numbers. I don't really have anything else to add to that, I just thought it was random. I can't imagine it was a riveting read, but it wasn't really meant to be. It apparently invented something called the random number table, which is used in statistics for randomly selecting samples. I hate math, so I can't really speak to that anymore. There were some paragraphs in the book too, but mostly numbers. Lots and lots of numbers. 26 sets of them to be exact. Herbert Hoover served as the Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And it was in this position that, on April 7, 1927, he appeared in the first public demonstration of AT&T's television broadcasting. Hoover gave a speech from Washington, D.C. to New York, then a man from AT&T talked to him. This was quite a technical achievement, and as the New York Times said with wonder, the speaker on the New York end looked the Washington man in the eye as he talked to him. On the small screen before him appeared the living face of the man to whom he was talking. Time, as well as space, was eliminated. Hoover, like, well, everyone else at the time, was not used to using television, so he kept looking down at his speech and held the phone so that it covered the lower half of his face. But finally, near the end, he turned his head, and the people on the receiving end could see him clearly. Well, as clearly as anyone could have on the 2 by 2.5 inch screen. The demonstration also featured another man talking from New Jersey, a vaudeville act, and a comedy routine. The very next day, the New York Times reported that John Logie Baird, usually considered the father of television, announced his plan to do the first transatlantic television broadcast, which he did the following year. What times they lived in. Harold Lloyd's 1928 movie Speedy is a riot. It had a memorable cameo by Babe Ruth, as well as a less noticeable cameo by his famous teammate, Lou Gehrig. But perhaps the most interesting part of the movie to us now is when Lloyd does this. That's right, he got away with giving the finger in a big Hollywood movie during the censorship era. Since it's not really hidden, and Lloyd wouldn't have wanted to push the censor's buttons too much, we can assume that this gesture wasn't considered quite as offensive as it would become in later years. This trivia is kind of well known, but there's another, lesser-known 1920s movie that also used it. The year before, in 1927, in the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Ring, one of the characters flips the bird at a wedding party. I'll definitely have to keep these two clips on hand for use in future videos. This is Sergeant Major Jigs, an English bulldog that was officially enlisted in the Marines. This was a continuation of the practice of adopting mascot animals in military units, most recently in World War I. Originally named King Bulwark, he was officially enlisted into the Marines in 1922, and his name was changed to Jigs. After 3 weeks, he was promoted to corporal, and about a month later was promoted to sergeant, and about 6 months after that, he was finally promoted to sergeant major. And fun fact, he even appeared in the 1926 movie Tell It to the Marines, starring Lon Chaney. The dog wore a blanket with his rank patch sewed on each side, and a Marine's cap. In 5 years of service, it was estimated that he had traveled more than 100,000 miles by air, land, and sea. Jigs died in January 1927 at either 7 or 8 years old. His body laid in state and had a Marine Guard of Honor. He was buried in a small casket made from the wood of his kennel. He received a military burial and was laid to rest at the Quantico, Virginia Athletic Stadium. After the death of Jigs, 2 English bulldogs were found to replace him, Private Paget and Sergeant Major Jigs II. Private Paget didn't have a long run, dying in 1928, and he was replaced by his 3-month-old son, Private Paget Jr. I don't know about you, but my favorite is Jigs II, at least in terms of appearance. I mean, look at that face. But which of these leather-necked dogs do you like the best? Let me know in the comments. World War I officially ended for the US in 1921. For many of you Americans watching, you probably think that World War I ended in November 1918, when the fighting stopped, or maybe in June 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. For virtually all the countries that had been involved, the war was formally over after the Treaty of Versailles, except for the United States. For them, the war wasn't formally finished until July 2nd, 1921. Of course, there was no actual fighting still going on. Not for that war anyway. This was only a formality. President Woodrow Wilson had tirelessly pushed the idea of creating an international organization of nations, which later became the League of Nations. The problem was, he didn't have enough support in the Senate. Because of this, America didn't join the League of Nations, and also didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which the US had previously signed. So, the US had to sign and ratify separate peace treaties with the former Central Powers. Technically, a state of war still existed between the US and those countries until President Harding signed the Knox-Porter Resolution, which ended that state of war. Peace treaties soon followed, and the separate treaty with Austria was signed on August 24, 1921, followed by the treaty with Germany on August 25th, and the treaty with Hungary on August 29th. For those of you interested in American politics, here's an interesting fact for you. After Woodrow Wilson left office on March 4th, 1921, there was a trifecta of party control, with the Republican Party being represented by the President, Warren G. Harding, and also holding a majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And that continued until the end of the decade. While this is definitely not the first time this had happened, it just shows how much the Republican Party dominated throughout the 1920s. This was partly in response to the progressivism and internationalism of the Wilson administration, which had fallen out of favor. Harding ran on a platform that was insistent on staying out of global affairs as much as possible, and voters responded very positively to that. Just look at the majority for the 67th Congress in the House. 300 Republicans and only 132 Democrats. That means that the Republicans had more than 2/3 of all seats. That's crazy in a nerdy sort of way. Adolf Hitler, the man who shall not be named, don't kill me YouTube, renounced his Austrian citizenship in April 1925, the year after his failed takeover of the Bavarian government. It was considered whether or not to deport him back to Austria after being convicted, but the Austrian government argued that by serving in the German army and emigrating to Bavaria, he had forfeited his Austrian citizenship. The Austrian government didn't take away his citizenship, though, but Hitler applied to have it taken away, and it was granted. The thing was, he hadn't become a German citizen yet, and wouldn't until 1932. That means that from April 1925 until then, he was, legally speaking, stateless.
Oh my goodness!
I haven't talked much about South Africa on this channel, and I don't think I'll really have many good opportunities to. But I recently learned that the Afrikaans language was officially recognized as a separate language in 1925. It's closely related to Dutch, but it was eventually determined that it was different enough to be categorized as more than just a Dutch dialect. Of all the current countries, the only one that was officially established in the 1920s was Egypt. Of course, Egypt had been around for a very long time before, but the modern state was only established in 1922, when it gained independence from Britain. And did you know that tug of war used to be an Olympic sport? It was removed from the list after the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium. If you're wondering how that turned out, the UK won gold, the Netherlands won silver, and Belgium won bronze. Italy and the US also competed, but didn't win anything. You might have heard about all the violence in Chinatowns in big cities in America in the late 1800s. But what you might not know is that this string of violence was called the Tong Wars. And the only reason I bring it up is because they apparently ended in the 1920s. There were no more murders related to factional violence after 1922, and the last slave girl raid occurred in 1925. And believe it or not, the Indian Wars also ended in the 1920s, sort of. Of course, it wasn't nearly as intense as it had been decades earlier, but the last minor conflict was the Posey War in Utah in 1923, where 2 Native Americans died. The next year saw the last Apache raid, in which some Apache men stole some horses. This is pretty much the last event considered to be part of the American Indian Wars. And those are all the random facts I have for now, but I'm sure I'll find some more later. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.